Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to be working on the new Primarch of the Dark Angels miniature, Lionel Johnson himself. I'm very excited to start this project as I'm a long-time Dark Angels fan, and for anyone who remembers the Twitch streams, you'll no doubt be aware of just how much I was looking forward to a new Lion one day. In the first video, I'll be covering how I painted this black-green armor, and it's perhaps using a little more advanced techniques than a standard Space Marine, but hopefully I can start to explain my process and techniques so that it might start to dispel some of the apparent difficulty. So without further ado, let's get into the video. When it came to the sub-assemblies, this is what I decided to go for, as I found it simpler just to have the whole front leg separate, and it was easy enough to twist this into place once it was painted. This does however mean that I'd have some gap filling to do in the cloth areas once it was fully painted, but with the complexity of this miniature I couldn't really avoid this completely. I'll make sure to cover how I go about filling these gaps in a future video. I'm starting off here by using a black airbrush primer, and I built this up over a couple of thinned layers. You could also use Chaos Black or any other can primer for this. And once that was dry, I then applied a solid layer of AK Black. Now, I know that with the primer being black, you might think that it's a bit of a pointless step in reapplying another layer of black paint. However, if I was just to leave this primer as the base coat, I would have some real trouble trying to match the finish later on. So this way, I'm able to correct any mistakes and paint back over areas later on without having any issues. Now, with this solid black base coat, I can then start to apply some initial highlight stages, and for this armor I'm going to be using the same recipe as the box art version with some very minor tweaks. I'm also going for that very reflective looking shiny black-green armor. Starting off here with a 1-to-1 mix of Corvus Black and Caliban Green, and the way that I'm applying this is quite different to how I would normally apply the first stage highlights on a regular Space Marine, and the paint consistency here is somewhere between that of a layer and a glaze. I started to apply this quite broadly towards the edges of the armor panels and anywhere where I wanted to build up the reflections later on. This first stage is also quite subtle, and I did find it was a little tricky to see much of an effect to begin with, but it's really important to get this stage everywhere, as not only will it help with the smoothness of the later transitions, but it also starts to add some of the colour into the armor. I also recommend using quite a large brush here, something around size 2 or even 3. As not only is it going to make covering these larger areas much easier and quicker, but it also likely means you'll end up with a smoother result. Now, I continued this on for the main body of the lion, using the box art version as a good reference for where to place the lighting. And if you are unsure about this or you struggle to think about where to place your lighting, then having some kind of reference for this is a great idea, or even just replicating a piece of work that you really like. When it comes to lighting in the heavy metal style, I like to imagine 4 spotlights at roughly each corner of the miniature. This method is designed to make non-metallics and other highly reflective surfaces to look good from every angle. Now for the next stage, I'm going to be adding more Caliban Green into the previous mix, so now the ratio is roughly 1 part Corvus to 3 parts Caliban Green. And I'm applying this a bit more like the usual chunky edge highlight stage to begin with, and then going a bit broader with this around the reflections. As I've mentioned in previous videos, it's much easier to glaze back down in value, so if I do go slightly too far with these stages, then it's quite easy to take some thinned down AK black and simply glaze it back down. Now for the next highlight stage, and here's where I made a slight change from the original recipe, opting to add Sons of Horus into the previous mix at around a 1:1 ratio. I think personally the Sons of Horus stage seemed a little too much of a jump in contrast on its own, so adding this extra step would help to keep the transition smooth. Slightly altering recipes like this is not uncommon in the studio, and is very much down to individual taste. Adding an intermediate step doesn't really affect the end result too much, other than to perhaps smooth out the transition slightly, and perhaps also mean that I don't have to glaze back as much later on. You'll notice that when I'm painting the leg here that I started off with an edge highlight first, and then I moved on to building up the more blended reflections. Later on, when I came to paint the same stage on the body, I did this the opposite way around this time, opting to paint the blended areas first, before moving on to the edge highlights. I like to approach these two types of highlights separately, but there's no right or wrong order to do this in. With the edge highlights, I'm still using quite a thin down paint at this stage, and building up to an opaque highlight, with a thickness somewhere between the initial chunky stage and the final sharper stages. I would say that once I got onto the more blended areas, it was even more important to be patient and build up the highlight gradually over several controlled thin glazes. Sons of Horus Green can be a little bit difficult to work with, as the coverage isn't great and it also contains some white pigment, and this can go a little bit chalky. But the important thing to remember is if it starts to look too chalky, then stay patient and keep building up the paint to a more opaque layer. If the outside of the transition is then not smooth enough, we can easily glaze back down with some of the previous mix afterwards. Again, I continued this on for the chest and body, this time concentrating on the more blended areas first. I'm using a very light and delicate touch with the brush, with a glaze consistency paint to slowly build up the transitions, and this also helps to avoid building up any physical texture on the surface. So at this point I decided to glaze back in between these stages with a very thinned down version of the previous mix to smooth out the blends. You can see here that the glaze is not just very diluted, but there's also a very small amount of paint on the brush, and this is how it should be, just damp and not leaving pools of the glaze on the surface. Glazes like this will be dry within a few seconds. Now it was time to get back to the edge highlights, and next up for the sharper highlight stage I'm going to be using pure Sons of Horus green. I'm starting to become a lot more controlled now with this stage, as the shift in value is starting to become much more obvious. Again, with the leg, I'm focusing on the edges first before moving on to the more blended areas. Again, you don't have to do it in this particular order, and in fact on the body you'll see that I skipped the blending stage first. Now, I know there's nothing too complex about edge highlights, and I'm sure I've explained this a lot in previous videos by now, but I thought I'd still show the process for anyone unfamiliar. Essentially, it comes down to a lot of brush control, which is a skill like any other and simply gets better with practice. Of course, a nice sharp and good quality brush will also help, along with plenty of lighting, and if you struggle to see, then a good magnifying headset will also help. And just as I showed previously, if at any point during these stages you feel like glazing back with the previous stage, then you can absolutely do this to smooth out the transitions. And in fact, this is even mentioned in the box art recipe for the line. And I think that's really the difference between painting like this and the traditional base coat and highlight method. There's always going to be some glazing back and forth, and in my experience it's pretty much unavoidable to some degree. But really being able to master this technique is an incredibly useful tool and essential for taking your painting to the next level. Now for the sharpest stage highlight, I'm going to be using a mix of 2 parts Sons of Forest Green to 1 part Carrick Stone and 1 part Rakarth Flesh. Here I've pre-mixed the Carrick Stone and Rakarth Flesh in a dropper bottle to make it a bit easier to keep it consistent. But you don't really need to do this, as long as you keep it roughly to this ratio, it should look fine. I'm thinning this very little for the actual edge highlights, because I want to create a nice opaque sharp highlight in as few passes as possible. In contrast to this, I approach the more blended areas with a very thinned down version of the same paint, instead slowly building up the softer blends with a more delicate application of the colour over several layers. Now this is the kind of paint consistency that I'm talking about with these blended areas, although you must make sure not to overload your brush, and if you notice only the tip of the brush has a very small amount of paint on it, and that allows me to make these micro adjustments and bring up the highlights smoothly. From the beginning of the project, it's always been my plan to really push this miniature to a display level, so there's really no need to rush these transitions, but really being able to master this glazing technique is an incredibly useful tool to have, and really essential to take your painting to the next level. As I continued on with these highlights, I lightened them by adding a touch of white into the previous mix, and I used this very sparingly towards the sharpest corners, and also right at the middle of the specular highlights. Again, you really don't need very much of this stage. When trying to paint to your best level, there's always going to be some bits that you either miss or you decide that they need some extra work, and it's never too late to go back with any of the previous stages. In particular, when I'm painting for display, I often like to paint in sections, and inevitably there's always some areas like this that are missed along the way. Now, I continued on with this highlight stage for the rest of the body on the lion. So with the majority of the highlights now placed, there was just time to smooth out some areas further with a few final glazes, this time using a very thinned down Caliban green. And as you can see here in real time, just how fine these glazes are. Very little paint is on the brush, and you can also see how quickly they dry. The effect of each glaze appears to be very subtle, but when trying to paint for the highest level for competition, all of these minor adjustments are really important for the final result. Now onto the final white dot highlights, although to be honest I rarely use pure white. This time I added some of the previous highlight mix into the white until I was left with a very bright off-white. If this is still a bit too harsh once you've applied it to the miniature, then you can lightly blend this out with some of the previous highlight mix. And for the final touches here, I quickly went round and picked out all of the rivets. The larger ones were highlighted with the previous stages, with transitions towards the bottom of the rivet and an off-white dot painted towards the top, quite similar to how you'd paint a gemstone. And that's about it for this video, everyone. In the next part, I'll be tackling the cloak and the other cloth areas on the miniature. Catch you next time.